The 8th president of the United States was not a native English speaker, and it's not because he was an immigrant or something. President Martin Van Buren probably has the most Dutch-sounding name of any US president. But he wasn't Dutch, at least not by nationality, he was American. And his ancestors weren't even Dutch before they were Americans, they were British subjects. Van Buren was from Kinderhook, New York, which was originally part of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Then over the next century, these ethnic Dutch settlers became British subjects and then Americans. However, this didn't mean that they stopped speaking Dutch. In fact, Dutch was still spoken in certain areas of New York well into the 1800s. Many Kinderhook residents were monolingual speakers, meaning they didn't even know English, or if they did, they learned it later in school. And that was the case for Van Buren, who didn't start learning English until he was about 6 or 7. But even then, he was reported to have a slight Dutch accent later in his life. Although to date he's the only US president who wasn't raised speaking English, it wasn't as weird to people back then as it seems today. And that's because before mass immigration to the United States in the mid to late 1800s, it was kind of accepted that different regions of the country had their own persistent ethnic identities. And although English was the language of politics and of the public sphere, many presidents prided themselves in their multilingual abilities. And communities like Kinderhook or speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch or Louisiana French flourished. They were united by shared ideals, not necessarily one language or ethnicity. But the one nation, one language ideal really started taking off in the late 1800s with a large influx of German, Irish, and Italian immigrants. Since these groups weren't part of the old stock, there was more of a perception that it was their responsibility to assimilate. But this attitude also affected the more deeply rooted communities like the Kinderhook Dutch speakers. And by the end of the 1800s, the language was in steep decline. Although supposedly even into the 1930s, there were some people who could still understand it a little bit.